Okay, we are live. Welcome to the first seminar for the theory course at the Synthetic Landscape Lab. The seminar is hosted by Teresa Greskova and will be presented by Dr. Marco Paletto and myself, Professor Claudia Pasquero. The title of the seminar is Deep Green, Green Architecture in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Marco, please, you can.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you everyone for being here this morning. It's good to see a good number of you. And we'll try to start this seminar today with this idea of what we call the dissolving boundaries between the city and nature. And this is a condition that obviously has been part of the various programs and the Synthetic Landscape Lab for a few years now, but we are now approaching, I think, a very interesting threshold moment, I shall say, because of course not only the uniqueness of this year has pushed us more and more into the virtual space, if you want, but on the other hand, also a whole set of new techniques and tools have become available that allow us to experiment with the protocols of artificial intelligence in a way that it wasn't really possible before. So in that sense, I think the scope of landscape architecture has certainly found a completely new dimension, which is really there to be investigated by you guys. And I think this is really exciting in that sense. I believe landscape architecture is probably one of the most fertile terrain for architectural investigation these days. So I think today what we're trying to do is to somehow set a little bit of a conceptual background for these investigations, and also we will illustrate some practices that belong to Ecologic Studio as well as the Synthetic Landscape Lab, for how we or you guys may approach these opportunities. And so in that sense, this is really kind of offering a sort of a ground zero for how this exploration may unfold in the weeks to come. Now I'm joined by Professor Pasquero as well. I think we're going to share
the screen for
the
this
screen, so it's a little easier on our connection. I think you know us. I'm co-founder and director of Ecologic Studio. I've been lecturing in Innsbruck now for a few years, and yeah, it's just really great to be back and continuing to do so. And thank you, Teresa, for organizing this as well. And so, well, I mean, our practice, you may have seen already a few things in previous lessons. As I said, we investigate what I may call the dissolving boundaries between city and nature, a territory that we have named the urban sphere. And what we mean by urban sphere is really a terrain where nature exists in forms other than what we shall call the ideal green. And architecture too comes alive in this context. So the architecture of the urban sphere can no longer be described typologically or through separate scalar and material domains, and it is by definition distributed and transscalar. Here, in the meantime, you can see some examples of projects that we have developed in the last 4 or 5 years, and that are essentially trying to pioneer or to test this kind of approach where infrastructure and living systems or ecosystems merge into one another. The new perspective that this type of architecture brings forward, I would say, gives the discipline of architectural design with a radical expansion of its scope, which we as a practice embrace, and we obviously try to contribute to in terms of the overall discourse. The urban sphere, as we called it, can be defined as a global apparatus of contemporary urbanity. a concept that calls for architects to curate knowledge across domains of science, art, and engineering. In this conception, the architect's ability to see and think spatially is essential, is crucial to the articulation of new forms of ecological intelligence. So our research focuses on building architectures, installations, and digital protocols that are testing human interaction with non-human systems. And here are some of the examples from our practice, as well as a little view into experiments that we have been conducting in the labs with non-human species and their interaction with artifacts that we have designed and constructed.
So
one of the critical starting points now is that this condition we are experiencing, this transition we are experiencing, somehow hides what we may call a paradox or nagging paradox, and we sort of called it the green ideology. And but I think it really goes back into a kind of vision of nature, or urban nature, that is perhaps one of the most enduring aspects we have inherited from modernity. And it's what I may call a sanitized vision of nature. In a sense, it did respond to necessities of rendering some of the most dangerous aspects of nature safe. If you imagine at the time, most cities after industrial revolution were heavily polluted and had areas that were absolutely unhealthy to inhabit. So the idea of zoning, of separating functions and separating elements of nature, such as waste, from the areas of living and enjoying the city were functional and crucial. But in a way, this has evolved a sort of a notion of urban green that is very much devoid of these aspects that are, in a way, crucial to the metabolism of the city. And I think this in time has evolved into the sort of situation we are now, and that we are trying to somehow discuss or reframe with this work.
So today we all know the impact that the metabolic linear city, as we can call it, the one that we are in, has on the biosphere. And since we have surpassed 4 billion people living in dense urban environment, we know it is only a matter of time before the biosphere ecosystem reach a tipping point. Nevertheless, we failed to act. Government failed to reach agreement. Even cities are failing to implement far-reaching policy. Why and how can architecture and landscape architecture contribute? We believe it involves our contemporary notion of nature. Modernity and modernism has not only sanitized our city, but also our view of what is natural, or better, our concept of nature. We came to believe that such rationally organized environment that we consider our modern living habitat can apply to the biosphere as a whole. Today, we have a machine-like model of nature dominated by the concept of an ideal equilibrium. We talk about carbon neutrality and re-green city as if such fixes will be able to reverse the unbalance of nature and bring back its ideal equilibrium. As if we can move a slider and go back in time in the condition of the biosphere. But this is not how the biosphere actually works. In fact, it is a non-linear system composed of billions of interlocking feedback loops. Change is its defining quality. Equilibrium is always precarious and dynamic. Decay, digestion, dissolution, and death are some of the most fundamental processes of nature and critical part of its circularity. This process often takes place in the dark. They generate strong odors. They trigger in us atavistic fears or contagion. They constitute what somebody has called the dark phase of ecology that we have all but erased from our consciousness, but it is critical to the functioning of ecosystem in the biosphere. Most of these processes take place within the microbiome, the world of microorganisms such as algae, fungi, and bacteria. Microorganisms have exceptional property that makes them capable of turning what we consider pollution or waste into nutrient and raw material. They can grow anywhere, including dense and polluted urban environment. The urban microbiome is the missing link to close the metabolism of the planet Earth. Cyanobacteria can be an example.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of we would like to spend maybe a little bit of time now illustrating some of the work we have done with these organisms, and in a way, like we've been asked many times, how did we came about working with microalgae as a sort of building material, if you want. And you know, obviously there are multiple answers to this. You sometimes bump into things by chance, but of course there is a research, there is a search for going deeper into how nature operates. And microalgae end up being in a kind of special place in the biosphere because of their properties, because of their ability to photosynthesize, because their body is basically able to eat and remetabolize pretty much anything they come into contact with. And that's why they kind of occupy a special place in the oceans, and they absorb most of the CO2 in the world. But also they become somehow quite exceptional material when it comes to integrate them into the artificial habitats, let's say, that we can design within the urban realm. And this project here is called Photosynthetica, and it's one of the largest installations we made, attempting to transform existing building, in this case from the 70s, is in the front of Dublin Castle. It's actually where the Irish Revenue and Custom is located. So it's a quite important building in Ireland. And so the challenge here was to demonstrate that it is possible to remetabolize and these existing stock of buildings. And again, this is the experiment was also really a way to demonstrate, you know, of what happened when these organisms are grown in and around a building, and therefore they stop being just simply biomass, but they become really symbiotic, if you want, to the built environment. Therefore, what the building emits, such as CO2 and heat, becomes a part of these, let's say, artificial habitat, where algae, we discovered, end up growing faster and even more efficiently than in the wild, precisely because they can feed on the emission of the building. And conversely, of course, they are able to emit oxygen, which people can breathe, as well as generate biomass that can be a useful source of energy and material for the operations of the building itself. So what is interesting is that in this new kind of symbiosis, we could argue that, let's say, the green aspects of ecology versus the kind of dark aspects of it somewhat are re-engaging with each other. So we are no longer, in a way, forced to hide this byproduct of urbanization, but they can be back on in front of a facade of the building and become part of its architectural apparatus, as well as the infrastructural performance of the building itself. Here, the diagram also illustrates a little bit how the prototype actually work, and essentially allowing, let's say, dirty or polluted air to be inoculated at the bottom and naturally rising through this snaky cavity. That's where they come into contact with the molecules of algae and they are remetabolized and clean. And the performance of the system is interesting, especially when we compare it with what is now become the symbol of the green revolution, if you want, or the urban regreening, trees. Not everybody now wants to plant trees, and I mean that's obviously a good thing. But at the same time, there is an interesting comparison when you begin to imagine this as a part of the building envelope, as a part of an infrastructural apparatus. You realize that trees they are not very effective, or we shall say algae are extremely more efficient at this remetabolization task, precisely because they are monocellular organisms and they are entirely devoted to that. So this makes them an interesting proposition, but also gives, creates opportunities to begin to imagine how to turn that linear metabolism Claudia was mentioning before, and to start activating, creating a new circularity within the processes of the urban sphere. And so, again, if we look at algae as these kind of biological machines that enter into these processes, this mechanism, we can begin to break down and see how effectively CO2 pollutants, elements from the city metabolism, as well as the sun, of course, enter the equation, power the growth of these organisms. And what we extract is, of course, biomass, oxygen, data, which inform the performance of the building itself. But then from this biomass, again, new processes branch out. We know algae are already part of new economies in future food, biofuels, bioplastic, biofibers and materials. So there is a whole kind of new ecosystem of productive activities, of renewable productive activities that can begin to take place in cities. And so when you think about the urban landscape as this kind of fertile, productive terrain, you can begin to imagine how these could take shape and multiple shapes in the city of the future. And of course, I think as designers, architects, we are not here just to speculate about this. I believe we are here to begin to actually test the different scenarios. What are the urban landscapes of the future? How do they look like? What they are made of? And there is obviously infinite possibilities which our ingenuity and imagination can produce. And these are some of what we have done in the last couple of years with facade installations here in Helsinki, on the Nobility House Palace, and then as well as in the urban realm, this urban algae folly in Aarhus, in the Denmark, in the port. In this project, actually, we grew within the sculpture, we grew aquatic cultures from the port of Aarhus. So this became a sort of a lens to make visible what you can't see with the naked eye, and then to actually allow people to realize the diversity that is present in those waters. And again, of course, aesthetically, it's a kind of research of how infrastructure and nature meet and inform each other. So how we can use, in a way, these kind of languages and sort of hybridize them and produce a new landscape that is somehow reminiscent of both. And this is another version of this membrane. And it's a little video that shows the way it works. And this project was actually in Milano for the Expo 2015. And in this prototype, the cultures, they actually flow within the canopy. So they are pumped up to the top, and then they flow by gravity within the membrane of the canopy. So they have the double function of essentially remetabolizing CO2 and grow and produce vegetable proteins, but at the same time also to be a kind of shelter, a microclimatic moderator for whoever would gather around and under the structure. So again, we were playing with this idea of creating new possible synergies between these creatures, these organisms, and humans, and how architecture becomes a bit of an interface between them. And this project, you probably have seen more recently. It was in fact designed here in Ecologic, but also manufactured and printed in the lab in Innsbruck. It's a really exceptional achievement. I think the team did in the Synthetic Landscape Lab, and the project was produced for the Saint Pompidou. But then I think it had a really great success in kind of steering the debate, and ended up being presented in Vienna for the Biennale of Architecture, and then finally in Tokyo at the Mori Gallery. Here, I think the really exciting elements of the 3D printing technology, well, it's not so much of the, well, it is part, of course, the achievement of 3D printing such a large structure, high resolution structure, but I think it's also very much the ability to print a substratum that can host a living creature of a microscopic scale and effectively create a porous three-dimensional substratum for them to grow and to survive. And this is something that is become quite possible just now because we have the ability to basically model material at such fine scale, fine resolution, so that we can begin to operate at the scale of this creature, these living organisms. So while, let's say, some of the structure you have seen before, the algae were essentially contained within the membrane, I think what is really exciting about this project is that it explores the idea in which the container is broken in a way, the container acquires a resolution that is comparable to the one of the organisms it's hosting. So essentially you have a really full three-dimensional porous matrix that can be inhabited by these creatures. And of course, in that sense, it's also open to an exchange with the surrounding world that is much more intense and potentially impactful. This is the view from Tower of Mori Gallery, 54th floor above Tokyo. It was really quite exciting room to be installing Hortus. And yeah, I kind of like the reflections here, not just because of the way they look, but somehow like kind of bring it in a completely new context when you project it onto the requirements of and the future of such a city, which again triggered a kind of reflection of what would it be like to imagine a large scale structure that would host these living cultures together with researchers, humans, and other wildlife in the city. And so that's where the Photosynthetica Tower project came about. And as you can see, kind of extends and expands that logic of the three-dimensional receptive matrix to an urban scale, in which it can really act as a microclimatic moderator or filter, if you want, and really harvesting particle or pollutants from the air and remetabolizing them into nutrients, useful material for the operation of the building itself, for wildlife and people to coexist within its matrix. And is the vision from the internal lobby of the building itself, and again, like how the algae farming system acts as much as a skin, as a membrane, as well as an infrastructural element of production.
So in this type of project, what we discuss as green and dark ecology is reconnected. There are multiple interactions in building that can be activated by the intelligence of microorganisms, or in this case, of microalgae colony. This type of microorganisms grow faster in synthetic landscape or in biochemical environment than in the wild, because they are very closely connected with the life of the building that stimulate its biomass growth. The carbon and pollutant are captured and remetabolized as biomass. The biomass, in turn, can be used by the inhabitants of the building itself as a form of energy, food, to create a new form of symbiosis. Somebody called it the symbiosis after the Anthropocene. I just heard yesterday in a conference. So here you see one of the 3 units of the Biotech Hut. The Biotech Hut was built in Astana for Astana Expo and is a permanent photosynthetic architecture, which aim at interacting with the urban microbiome. Is 180 square meter in plan and divided in 3 units. The one that you see here is the garden. It contains 1,600 liters of microalgae. So here you can see the 3 units, so the garden, the living, and the lab, which reinterpret a possible apartment, a possible living unit that integrate cultivation and inhabitation, human and non-human life. But how is this integrated? So the flow of material are directly generating space articulation and allow the interaction with flow of matter, information, and energy. So, for example, the Biotech Hut can be energy self-sufficient and is able to produce 10 kilowatt hour of energy every day. What you see before, it was, for example, the lab, where we had a scientist in residence that was demonstrating which kind of material is possible to produce with the microalgae, but also which type of food is able to extract from it. There were multiple types of microalgae and species that were present in the Biotech Hut, ranging from cyanobacteria and such as spirulina and chlorella for the production of food. So it was able to produce a protein equivalent to the one that will be produced by the breeding of 8 cows. But also, you want to add something? Yes, please. What do you want to?
No, I mean, it's okay.
So the third type of environment is the living environment. So it was an area of interaction with these numbers. So this number gives us a spatial and material dimension of the efficiency of the building integrated culture and of its ability to interact with the urban structure. It is a crucial transition from architecture as a machine for living to architecture as a living machine.
So when we look at basically this perspective, and we think about the urban landscape as populated by architectures that are productive and that are essentially becoming alive in that sense. So then, of course, the whole logics of the infrastructure, the whole logic of the city, the way it performs an urban landscape changes. And one way to see it is through drawings, of course, and these projects in Tallinn, which we did in 2017 as part of the Biennale of Architecture, which Claudia was curating. It kind of shows the current status of the wastewater infrastructure, for instance, where basically fluids from every household are pretty much collected and converge into the water treatment plant. And so if you reimagine this process as a kind of distributed system where essentially this, let's say, feedback between emissions and remetabolization happens locally, then you can begin to understand how individual buildings and green areas and areas of living systems actually together forms little networks, local networks that exchange material and remetabolize waste to produce new ones. So the diagram that you've seen before is somewhat redefined or redescribed in a kind of distributed way as you see in this image. And again, here it was a speculative project looking at the future of Tallinn, which, as you know, is on the Baltic Sea, and it's very much prone to flooding as the sea level will rise. So we kind of imagined how this wet city would essentially transform itself once somehow semi-submerged by water, but also how this, let's say, new aquatic domain would effectively redefine the morphology of the city, not only because of the requirements of bridges and other structures, but also because of the opportunities that are offered by these new ecosystems becoming part of the urban landscape and its infrastructure. And here we are zooming towards the tip of let's say, the Tallinn Peninsula. It's called Paljassaare, which is precisely where the let's say water treatment plant today exists in a kind of strange coexistence, or perhaps we should say conflict, with the tip of the peninsula, which is now a part of the Natura 2000 network, as a kind of protected area for birds and other wildlife systems. So there is right now a quite distinct, let's say, condition, which as a part of this project we attempted to reimagine. And so the starting point for reimagining this was essentially this network of wastewater treatment that, rather than being focused and condensed onto the treatment plant, was made to inform and reinform the wilderness of the peninsula. So rather than imagining the condition of protected natural reserve as in opposition to wastewater treatment, as basically two absolutely incompatible activities, we tried to imagine what would be a landscape that actually grow out of the interaction between these two conditions. And again, here are a series of drawings that explore this emerging landscape through a series of lenses, and eventually try to describe also morphologically how we could imagine a structure that grows on the tip of these islands and that operates as much as the water treatment plant as essentially building, hosting a series of living organisms and systems. These are some of the visions which we imagine this in different seasons as well. It's an area which is prone to freezing for 3-4 months a year, even more. So
all this project has been developed through a biocomputational algorithm called Fusarium polycephalum, or slime mold. The slime mold simulation that you see here, the slime mold is a protist, a single cell organism, which contain hundreds of thousands of tiny nuclei. In the plasmodium phase, the nuclei are afloat and are able to interact with each other and with the surrounding environment via biochemical reaction, creating what scientists call a biological computer or a form of bioartificial intelligence. They accumulate traces in the environment that form a distributed spatial memory of this interaction. This embedded memory is critical for collective intelligence, or emergent intelligence, which emerge in absence of a nervous system. It is due to billions of local, direct one-to-one interaction, and it is in this way that this behavior and the overall morphology emerge. Here, we develop an apparatus to capture this behavior. As you can see, there are remarkable similarities with urban networks, as seen from the satellite. And these are called minimized diffuse. But the way the behavior is emerging is rather different. Slime mold ecological intelligence manifests itself into the morphological convoluted of its network body and the fuzziness of its distributed spatial memory, define both the classical canon of beauty, symmetry, and proportion, and the rational logic of efficient engineering, equilibrium, and stability. There is no master planner or engineer to design it from the top down. It is a bottom-up emerging collective intelligence process at work. A critical quality of urban design today is to mobilize collective agencies. and intelligence to face the challenge ahead, especially the accelerated dynamic imposed by the climate crisis. So how do we use this living organism in order to develop future synthetic landscape, future planning method?
Yeah, so I mean, here it's probably one of the key conceptual notes that would be interesting to discuss also further. I mean, maybe we just mentioned it, and the opportunities offered by observation of such organisms in nature are quite exciting, but they also present a problem in a sense, and essentially the problem is how to, if you want, scale up such a model from the microscopic dimension of the organism itself to the city, right? And traditional architecture traditionally works through metaphors. I think I say human language uses metaphors quite a lot to make these projections, let's say, from one domain to another. But we feel that today it is possible to use a different technique, which is more akin to analogy than metaphor, and therefore we like to think of these as analog models. And the problem of translating, applying the analog models to different scales can be, of course, resolved in different way, but computationally and graphically we can now attempt new opportunities. So I think that our approach to working with these organisms at the moment is really to try to observe the diagrammatic capacity of the living system in the process of growing and becoming part of an architectural assemblage or apparatus. And as you were seeing in this example, the apparatus was very much also physical in the form of a substratum, a 3D printed substratum. But right now we also kind of at the dawn, I would say, of a new era in which we can begin to interface forms of intelligence such as the one of slime mold with a city and urban infrastructure in a way that works through digital systems and connects back into the real world through digital and robotic machines. One example is this workflow you see here, which we call deep green, and that essentially involves a combination of these. On one side, it actually extracts data from the urban landscape through remote sensing, using a digital elevation model, GIS data system, satellite monitoring, and then process them with the use of algorithmic design to produce a set of maps, a set of terrains. And within the context of this terrain, we can then apply a new set of algorithms, which are called GAN, Generative Adversarial Networks, which are a kind of machine learning algorithm that in a way we can train to behave like a slime mold, if you want, like to be an analog of the slime mold. And in that sense, perform and grow within this digital urban realm. So in that sense, we have started to develop a series of visions and projects, especially focused on the possibility and the opportunity of regreening, that we have applied, especially in a recent collaboration with the United Nations Development Program. This is in Guatemala City, one of the case studies that, as you may know, have a critical relationship with this with the waste and with the output of the city. I think Guatemala City is actually the largest landfill in Central America, and 90% of the waste dump is actually done illegally. So this has created now almost another territory, another landscape that is very much informed by this operation, and that actually is occupying many of the valleys in the middle of the city. So again, it's a condition in which to think about regreening without considering this infrastructural layer. It's just impossible. So it presents itself also as an interesting case study for the application of these kind of notions and concepts of a synthetic urban landscape that is capable of performing these functions. And here I just show briefly how we began to describe the city through algorithmic techniques, and making more kind of abstract descriptions of how this local collection, recycling, distribution points of waste may emerge across the urban landscape. In fact, they are already emerging. A lot of this activity of recycling and processing of waste is done essentially informally, locally, but also in a very unsafe way at the moment. So the idea is how do we begin to plan for a process that is very much bottom up in its nature, but that actually has clear logics and rules to it. And so this drawing kind of illustrates a bit how we can begin to simulate these networks as they appear and grow locally, and how we can begin to imagine testing, let's say, municipal strategies that would connect these local facilities into larger urban collection points. So again, we are thinking of these as a sort of terrain of simulation, but also as a way of restructuring the city morphology and its landscape. And this is when we started to introduce the logic of the slime mold, and we started to use generative adversarial networks to initially really translate one domain into the other. And here you can see some initial example of slime mold growing over the urban network systems and redescribing it, and then slowly how this is somehow applied to the kind of material composition of the city as we basically read it from satellite. In this case, the model is trained to detect and project the materiality of the satellite image to the morphology of the landscape and the patterns. So this, of course, can be used in different way, but as you can see here, we kind of deployed it to get a series of future projective scenarios of urban regreening, one where the networks become the kind of dominant arteries of the city, and the landscape is excavated in and around them, and conversely, one in which the main networks line become the actual veins of this new infrastructure of waste management and regreening. And again, we can also use this technique to project the time frame of these, so to study how this process can effectively occur in time. And again, time here is no longer the time of the phasing, is no longer a linear time, but is really a kind of a circular bifurcating time that is typical of complex ecosystems, and such as this one. But in this case, an ecosystem is no longer purely natural, but is really a kind of synthetic combination of urban infrastructure and landscape. And we, as you can see here, is our images from one of the thesis students who just graduated that applied a similar technique in the case of Kathmandu, Corbinian, his name is, and you can see the same technique applied in a kind of zoomed in version where the kind of tentacles, let's say, of this algorithmic logic are materialized throughout a very dense fabric of Kathmandu. And as you zoom out, you begin to see the emergent logics, emergent structures, which again are very much simulation of what if or possible scenarios that may or may not actualize, but allow us to develop, of course, visions and policies in a way that is very much dynamic and in constant feedback loop with the data that we can read and we can harvest from the urban realm. This to conclude, so then maybe we can have a couple of questions. I leave Claudia maybe to comment on this. It's a project that that was actually developed this year at the Urban Morphogenesis Lab here in London at the Bartlett School of Architecture, and it is very beautiful, I think, in the way it applies a similar set of techniques to a vision of London, of the London Docklands in 200 years' time. So again, a kind of a extreme future projection, but at the same time, you know, what is important here is that it's not trying to predict the future in that sense. It's really a kind of game of simulating possible futures.
Yeah.
And yeah, I leave Claudia to comment on it.
Yeah. In a way, the project looks at one of the scenarios that emerged from climate change prediction. One scenario was the emergencies, the appearance of a virus, which is the current pandemic we're living in. Another possible scenario is a big flood. So the studio looked at the possibility of this big flood happening in 200 years and investigate an architectural urban proposal where a different type of coexistence between human, water, and marshland wildlife could emerge. So it effectively engineered an architecture that is able to host human, but also to work with the water dynamic and host some of the wildlife that is currently present in the marshland. To do so, it developed a design method that deploy both biological and artificial intelligence to incorporate the data that we have now about big flooding and the territory and make a forecast of how the land will terraform. Here you see some of the terraforming and the reorganization of the urbanist land, and then how which type of materiality could be deployed. This is a form of biocement that use the local microalgae to construct this form of new piling system, consolidating this marshland. So this challenge, in a way, the role of design and visual language in discussing current ecological issue of climate change. And this is one of the topics we will discuss with different examples, not only an example, of course, coming from our work, but also example coming from critical architecture, such as Akita and Peter Cook, that will probably be one of our guest speakers, and other contemporary example in the world of philosophy and design of how this issue could be tackled.
I think we can conclude here, no, Claudia, and maybe I don't know if there is a.
Yeah.
You want to take some questions, or how do you normally?
I would stop the live stream here, and all the students can go back and check it later. So thanks for listening.
Okay. So